Colombia has just about everything that a country could want. I'm not exaggerating. Within these borders lies an extraordinary range of environments. Rainforests, highlands, plains, coastline, a level of biodiversity that isn't just scenic but deeply practical. I'm trying not to get too poetic, but look, this is a land of varied climates, soils and ecosystems capable of producing just about anything. From this ecological range comes fertile land. From fertile land comes abundant food. From abundant food comes the capability to support tens of millions of people. Now pair all of this with what sits beneath the land. Oil, coal, gold, silver. Need I go on? And I ain't finished there, because its positioning is a work of art too. The country has easy access to both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, which, in theory, gives it a multi-dimensionality to trade that very few countries enjoy. On paper, this is a country that should be prospering, but it's not. Its economy has long struggled, its security situation long been fragile, its state authority has often felt thin. And for that, I'm blaming these bastard mountains. And look, maybe it's remiss of me to refer to these honestly beautiful, towering pinnacles of rock as anything but magnificent, but in regard to the developments of Colombia, these guys have done their country a massive disservice. Take a look at this map. What these mountains really are the northern tip of the Andes, which, upon broaching the southern border of Colombia, don't pass through politely as a uniform range, but rather split themselves into three distinct ranges. The three cordilleras, as they are called in Spanish, with deep valleys between them, thick jungle in just about every peripheral lowland, and not a whole lot of a forethought put toward the effective movement of goods and services. On a map, Colombia looks compact, a neat little slightly angled box, but in reality it's shattered. You don't move across this country, you climb it, you descend it, and you perform these two actions at a snail's pace. And for most of its history, that has been the central problem. You see, civilization in Colombia has its roots in amongst these three cordilleras. For the original Native Americans here, the highlands, in comparison to the impenetrable jungles down below, was always going to be the path of least resistance for any lasting settlement. But whilst life in the highlands was flush with all the food and water that a person could ever want or need, and secure from the nightmare creatures that make the jungle biome just a complete shit show, it made the development of a unified Colombia very difficult. The Spanish learned this fast in the 1500s. They didn't try to stitch the mountains into a network. Instead, they put all their eggs into one basket, the Magdalena River. To Spain, this river was Colombia. It was the only way, after all, to actually transport the riches soaked into this land back home. And so, the port city Cartagena was fortified nearby the mouth of the Magdalena on the Caribbean coast, and every city that forms the backbone of Colombia today was built simply to lean toward this single drain. Transport between these nodes themselves was months-long Indiana Jones-style travel at best, and death, and more death at worst. Not that this mattered a whole lot to the Spanish, they just wanted the resources that the land itself had to offer. Bogota was developed atop the resource-rich Huesca Plateau because it had a steady source of labour to work the land and a direct, though brutal mule track down to the river. Cali developed in the fertile Cauca Valley, productive, valuable, but separated from Bogota by an entire mountain range. And in Antioquia, what would later become Medellin, began as a remote mining frontier, awkwardly outside the main flow because it was so hard to connect to the river at all. And so when Colombia seized independence from Spain in the early 1800s, it inherited a vast, resource-rich but deeply fragmented territory. Bogota remains the administrative center. The plateau on which it sat remains governable, but beyond that plateau, in places like Medellin, Cali, and the immense rainforest to the south and to the east, this centralized authority thinned quickly. Local strongmen could dominate their valleys for the simple reason that Bogota struggled to reach them in time to matter. Because imagine that you were a messenger in 1830 Colombia, tasked to send a decree to Cali. It's a painstaking mission. Even now, sunburned British travel vloggers have made a sport emphasizing the challenge that is traversing Colombia without even as much as a crumpet and tea to ward off the feelings of homesickness. But back then, pretending again that you're a government representative, you'd have needed to ascend and descend mountains, cross humid trenches, and survive thick swamps, dense fogs, landslides, malaria, and weeks of travel on mud-plugged mule tracks just to reach your destination. Ineffective communications means ineffective policing, spotty tax collection, minimal trade integration, and the development of cultural enclaves, loyal not to Bogota but to local power brokers. So the result was this: distinct regions, Antioquia, the Cauca Valley, the Caribbean coast, the Pacific coast, the Llanos plains, separate economies, separate cultures, distinct power structures. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Colombia remained a country where geography diluted authority. Roads improved, communications expanded, but in vast rural stretches, Bogota was an abstraction more than any sort of legitimate authority. In some valleys, power consolidated around landowning elites. In more remote highlands and frontier zones, communities operated with increasing autonomy. Two Colombias existed side by side, one hierarchical and one self-organized. Then, in 1948, the balance shattered. The assassination of liberal politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitan triggered La Violencia, a decade of brutal partisan bloodshed preceded by years of tit-for-tat political violence between proponents of Colombia's conservative and liberal parties. The numbers here are staggering. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of deaths, much of it in rural areas where the state was either absent or complicit. Amidst the chaos, elite landowners expanded holdings through coercion and violence. Remote communities, already accustomed to self-reliance, armed themselves, preparing for any incursions, be it from marauding landowners or the state itself. La Violencia formally ended in 1958, but the violence didn't disappear. In the remote highlands, armed self-defense remained. But by this point, these enclaves, who never ever benefited from the state and its infrastructure, started to market themselves as independent republics. To Bogota, this was intolerable. States often tolerate violence, they don't tolerate parallel sovereignty. By the early 1960s, amidst Cold War paranoia and mounting pressure to assert control, the government moved militarily against several of these enclaves. In 1964, the army launched a large-scale assault intended to dismantle what it viewed as a communist foothold. The operation only served to unify the movement though. The surviving fighters withdrew into the surrounding mountains and reorganized. What had been scattered rural self-defense groups coalesced into a more structured insurgency. That insurgency became the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a group better known today as FARC. To the clad forests, jungle basins, and the remotest parts of the Cordilleras, these guys absconded. And in these sanctuaries, far from the reliable reach of authorities, they flourished. The geography here, after all, was a haven for asymmetrical warfare. State forces required helicopters, jungle brigades, and vast logistical chains to contest terrain that guerrillas traversed with local knowledge and short supply lines. Every kilometre cost the state disproportionately more than it cost the insurgents. Over time, ideology, as is often the case, gave way to power and economics. FARC stopped being about self-determination and more about kidnapping, extortion, and eventually deep entanglement with the cocaine trade. The group became territorially embedded, taxing coca growers, controlling river crossings, administering rough justice in zones where the state could proclaim sovereignty but not enforce it. Right-wing paramilitary networks emerged in response, claiming to defend landowners and business interests. They too exploited geography. What followed was a multipolar conflict. Guerrillas, paramilitaries, criminal networks, each rooted in different regions, each sustained by Colombia's patchworked terrain. The result was a state trapped in permanent triage. Instead of knitting its regions together through infrastructure and economic integration, Bogota was forced to funnel billions into counterinsurgency. Troops were deployed to prevent territorial loss rather than to build cohesion. Pipelines were sabotaged, mining projects stalled, entire departments became security theaters instead of growth engines. In a more integrated country, rebellion might have been crushed or contained. In Colombia, this just wasn't the case. The mountains didn't create conflict, but they ensured that power would never be singular, and that the state would fight not just one war, but many, scattered across ridgelines that it could never fully control. Colombia today, well, it hasn't completely collapsed under the weight of its geography. Particularly over the last couple of decades, the state has asserted itself over its own terrain harder than any point in its history. Roads now snake through passes that once took weeks to cross. Air mobility has become routine. Intelligence networks have replaced blind patrols. In 2016, they used this leverage to strike a peace deal with FARC. This didn't necessarily dissolve the barrier that remains in the mountains. Many arms groups still flicker in the shadows, but it marks something completely different. The first serious attempt to compete with geography at a political level. Colombia today, it's fair to say, isn't a failed state in which the mountains dictate the country's present and future, but it is a negotiated one, constantly bargaining with its own terrain.